Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Henry Wonham, Professor and Head of the Department of English. Henry Wonham did his undergraduate work in philosophy at Princeton. He earned his MA and PhD in English at the University of Virginia. He came to Oregon in 1995. His research interests include Mark Twain, the writings of Charles Chesnutt, and ethnic representation in American literature. He's the author of numerous articles in professional journals, the editor of 2 books, and the author of 3 more, including Playing the Races, Ethnic Caricature, and American Literary Realism, published by the Oxford University Press in 2004. And he is also exceedingly modest. Welcome.
Well, we'll find out.
Exactly. Well, you've done so much, and you've published so much, and you kind of keep a low profile about it.
I try to have a high profile, Steve.
Is that right? So, and are you able to continue doing some of your own work while you're department head?
This has been my first year as department head, and I've managed to get some very, very small things done. Nothing ambitious, but some sort of minor, discrete projects that can be done in the 5 minutes here and there.
5 minutes here and there, yeah. So what do you think? You think you're going to be able to make it all work for you?
It's been a really rewarding year, actually.
Good.
Yeah, it has been rewarding in a very different way. I've never had what I would consider a real job before, where I show up at an office at 8:30 in the morning and then leave toward the end of the day.
Right.
And that has its gratifications. It's really been fun. It's a very different kind of work.
Right.
So I'm not really attempting to do both things at the same time.
Right. But it's really good that you're enjoying it and seeing it as a challenge in a new way for you.
Well, it's only been 1 year.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that have happened that are sort of unexpected for you? Things that you hadn't anticipated, because you were associate department head before. So what are some of the new things that you hadn't really thought might come your way that have?
There really haven't been issues or events that have snuck up on me and surprised me. I think I just underestimated the complexity of the job. The English department is a very large and complicated department, and there are lots of creative people doing lots of different things, and so it's been a little bit more challenging than I expected to be working for all those people and facilitating their endeavors and doing that effectively. It's not easy to do that for everyone at the same time.
Yeah, so it's like being a dean almost, because it's such a large enterprise. With how many faculty members?
We have 40 regular faculty members in English, and we typically employ something like 150 GTFs who are doing the bulk of the composition teaching,
graduate teaching fellows,
as well as a good deal of the literature teaching at the lower division, and we employ a substantial number of instructors too. So it's a big enterprise.
So we'll come back to the English department, but I want to ask you about your own writing and your own thinking. So how did you make the switch from philosophy to English in graduate school? How did that come about? Because you were a philosophy major at Princeton.
That's right. I was a philosophy major at Princeton, and I wrote a thesis on aesthetics, Martin Heidegger's aesthetics.
Oh,
wow. And I was not a good philosophy major. I was a solid B student as a philosophy major. I found it fascinating, but I was not gifted in that area. But I was so compelled by what I was working on that I felt I really needed to go on from this thesis on aesthetics, and I can't remember much more about it than that's what it was, to read some of the poetry that I was theorizing about. And that is something I hadn't really done in a systematic way as an undergrad, being a philosophy major. So I went to go get an MA at Virginia in English with the idea that that would be it, a 2-year MA, and then move on to something else. But I just loved what I was doing and stayed there for the PhD.
So was it a matter of both the material and particular professors that you had there that that turned you in the direction of making literary studies a career for you at Virginia?
I think it was writing. I think it was my own independent work, which I became more and more interested in, and I began to see this as something that I could do and do seriously for a long time. I had wonderful professors, certainly, but I think what I loved about it was the work that I was doing.
Now, so how about Twain? How'd you get interested in Twain?
I had a great seminar with a wonderful professor at Virginia, Harold Kolb, who ended up being my dissertation advisor. And he was very interested in the tall tale as a sort of a folk phenomenon in America. And that became my dissertation topic, was Mark Twain's innovative use of this oral tradition in his fiction.
Yeah. So, and then you went ahead and published a book on that from Oxford University Press.
That's right.
So tell me about this. I mean, Oxford, you got 2 books coming out of Oxford. Tell me about your relationship with Oxford Press. What made you go to that particular press with this material?
Well, I don't remember exactly what made me go there, but it turned out to have been a good decision. That was 1993, the year that first book came out, and that's also the year that a very well-known book on Twain came out with Oxford. Shelley Fisher Fishkin's book called Was Huck Black, which I knew a little bit about as it was being written, and it was just a coincidence that those 2 books came out at the same time. But I'm fairly sure that Oxford was interested in my manuscript because they had already identified this Twain initiative. Her book really made a big splash. It's one of those few academic books that gets mentioned in Time magazine and that sort of thing. And so I think that I probably profited a little bit from her own celebrity.
Well, so do people think that Huck was black?
Well, Shelley Fisher Fishkin thought that Huck was black, in the sense that that Twain, her thesis is that Twain discovered Huck's idiom through his experience with African American speakers. And there is some evidence to suggest that well, first of all, Twain was a real linguist in the sense that he really listened carefully and was a master at reproducing dialect. And she's able to document the fact that Huck's idiom has a great deal to do with the African American languages that Twain was exposed to.
So while he may not have been black, the idiom that Twain became so good at writing in somehow was influenced by that.
Yeah, and the idiom that a lot of people will say, in a sense, gave birth to the modern American novel or to modern American fiction. I mean, Huckleberry Finn is often regarded as a sort of a beginning point for a new direction in American fiction. And that has a great deal to do with Huck's voice. And Fishkin's theory is that we have never fully appreciated the African American inflection in that voice.
But there is it Jim? It's been a
Jim.
million years, Those were incredibly funny sections. I remember stuff about French, I don't remember exactly, but incredibly humorous.
Yeah, how come Frenchmen don't speak like us?
Whatever, So do you still read Twain? Do you still teach Twain?
Yeah, I do. I teach Twain whenever I have a chance to, and students love to read not just Huckleberry Finn, but they love to discover Twain.
And do you think you'll do more stuff on Twain?
In terms of research, I have one of those little projects lined up, one of those very small, discrete projects. This is about to be the 100th anniversary of an incredibly obscure manuscript that Twain wrote and didn't publish during his lifetime, called Number 44, The Mysterious Stranger. And so some scholars are going to put together an anthology of criticism on that manuscript because it's really very interesting, despite the fact that it wasn't published during his lifetime.
And you're going to contribute to that. How about Charles Chesnutt? How did you get involved with his work?
Chestnut was a contemporary of Twain's. Unlike Twain, he was not well known at all in his lifetime and never achieved popular success. He also writes in dialect, especially African American dialect, so there are some stylistic affinities. And I think he's a great writer. So unlike Twain, who's received probably more attention than any writer deserves, Chestnut has received far less. He is an African American writer and is often considered the first black writer to have reached a mainstream white audience at the turn of the century.
Right. And you say they were friends?
No, they weren't friends. They did meet, but they were contemporaries.
And so so you wrote this, was it a Twain? Different Twain. Did you, in this series where your book on Chestnut came out, and what series is
published by Twain Publishers, Twaine. Very,
exactly.
Completely different.
And so was there anything out there? Was there some standard book on Chestnut that was out there for the public to read?
More and more. There's no one standard, really good book of criticism on Chestnut since 1980. There's an excellent critical biography from that time. There's a lot of criticism recently on Chestnut, but still I don't think there is a seminal critical work on him.
Right. Did you enjoy writing that book?
Yeah, I think Chestnut is easily as interesting as Mark Twain, and there is at least as much to say about him.
Now you've also done work on the color line. You want to talk about what you mean by the color line?
Yeah, I did an anthology of criticism. I edited it, called Criticism and the Color Line, and the idea behind that book was that that in classrooms we tend to want to group writers and inevitably to segregate writers. So we have a course here in our department on African American writers, and we have a course on 19th century American writers. We tend to be talking about black writers in the one case and white writers, dead white male writers often in the other case. The point of that book was to suggest that there was in reality a great deal more crossover and cross-pollination than is usually recognized. And so it was sort of an attempt to say, let's rethink the way we package our writers and our periods so that we can appreciate that Ralph Ellison is not just a great black writer of the 20th century, but is a great American writer of the 20th century, and that he learned a great deal from a writer like Mark Twain. So when we teach students about American literature, I think we want to be careful about segregating it before even presenting it.
Well, tell me, what sort of reception did your argument meet, and has it had some ripple effects in the teaching of literature in the academy?
I honestly don't know. I mean, it's really hard to measure that. The reviews were fine. The reviews were positive. Whether, in fact, anything changed as a result, that seems doubtful.
Right.
But that book was a contribution to a conversation, and if it inspired other people to be involved in the conversation, then I think it did have some sort of an effect. So, for example, I teach a course right now on African American. Technically, it's on African American fiction, but my own theme for the course is the politics and poetics of black dialect in American literature. So this is a course that involves not just writers like Chestnut and Dunbar, who were famous black writers who employed black dialect, but it also incorporates white writers, some of them racist white writers, who also specialized in the use of black dialect, like Joel Chandler Harris or Thomas Nelson Page. And I think that there are other professors who are doing the same kind of thing, sort of breaking down the boundary between different kinds of writers.
Well, you talked about dialect, and you've also worked on caricature. So, what about that? And you mentioned a couple of these authors who deal with dialect were racist themselves. So isn't there a danger of when you go in that direction to caricature and stereotype?
Absolutely, and that's what makes that material so exciting as well as dangerous. But students are very savvy, and they understand exactly why this material, which is ostensibly entertaining, often crosses a line into something very different. And to watch that line and how it gets drawn, I think is a wonderful exercise for them. So my work on caricature obviously grew very naturally out of the work on dialect. Caricature, in the graphic sense, is a sort of an extension of the conventions of black dialect use from the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. You want to just tell us a bit about that book?
Sure, yeah. That book is called Playing the Races. It's specifically a book about American realism, the fiction of the latter part of the 19th century in America. So writers like William Dean Howells and Edith Wharton and Henry James are all featured there. And I'm essentially asking a question in that book about why realist writers, writers who identified themselves with truthful representation and aspired to a kind of a verisimilitude in their presentation of the world, why they so often deployed comic types, caricatures, especially in the realm of ethnic representation.
Mm-hmm. And your conclusion?
Well, I think there are lots of reasons. I think it's actually an interesting question because it's not an easy one to answer. In part, I think those writers were betraying some latent racist attitudes of their own. I think that they were participating in the sort of vocabulary of the period in a way that makes us want to be suspect about their realist and their progressive beliefs. But I think it's much more interesting than that. I don't think it's merely a case of genteel racism. I think it's in fact, caricature becomes a way for these writers to experiment with characterization.
Pound used to do those voices, didn't you? Did you talk about?
Well, that gets a little further into the 20th century than I go in the book. But I do talk a little bit about modernism as sort of what comes next, and Pound and Eliot loved to, in fact, correspond with each other in these dialect, idioms,
It's kind of hard to imagine T.S. Eliot doing that. It was probably good for him at some level.
Well, he published poems which also draw on those kinds of caricatures, and it's very interesting and hard to explain exactly what's going on there.
The English department. Come back to the English department. Tell us about some of the things that are studied in an English department today that when you were a graduate student at Virginia were just not part of the scene.
Well, I guess English departments are different anywhere you go. The Virginia English department was fairly traditional, and Virginia was one of those well-endowed universities that has departments for everything. We are slightly less well-endowed, and as a result, we have a much more dynamic English department in that we include the film program, for example. We include the folklore program. We include the composition program. So we have far more variety in terms of our faculty strength and obviously therefore in terms of curriculum than I remember from those old days. You could think of that as either a strength or a weakness. We wouldn't mind being better endowed.
Yes.
But I think of it as a great thing that we have courses on film and television in a department that also teaches Milton and Shakespeare.
And Irish studies?
And Irish studies now, thanks to the arrival of Mark Quigley, a new assistant professor. George Wicks taught Joyce and Yeats and Irish writers for many, many years and continues to do so in retirement. But we now have a young scholar who's brought a lot of energy to that field again.
And what about so-called ethnic American literary studies? How are we doing in that area?
We have built some real strength in that area, or let's say in those areas, because we're talking about many different traditions. But in Latino-Latina studies, we have made some real progress. We're searching next year for a senior professor to be a specialist in African American literature. That'll be, if we're successful, the first Horn professor of English in the English department. And so that area is growing fast and is really a very popular one with students.
Now, with all this expansion of the department in different areas, you mentioned film, television, ethnic American literary studies, folklore. Do you feel that there's a core to the English department? I mean, do people in the department have something in common beside the fact that they are all listed under the English department, you as without obviously getting into any personalities, is there something that everybody shares, and if so, what might that be?
In terms of subject matter or shared interests, I'd say probably not. And so I think that's the wrong way to approach the question. There really is no single subject matter, no canonical thing that we all believe in. But I think in terms of the activities that we're all involved in, there's a great deal that we share. We are all, in one way or another, involved in theorizing and interpreting representations, whether they are filmic representations or literary representations. We are all reading and thinking about what we read and teaching students to read critically and analytically. And more than that, teaching students to write in that way. And so that seems to me a far more important kind of affinity than whether or not we all think Shakespeare is the most important writer.
Right. What do you, so what would you say the real strengths of the department, this department is, or are? What are the strengths? What makes this department a distinctive department?
Well, I would almost try to dodge the question by, instead of naming a field where we have particular strength, I would say the strength of the department is in the faculty, which is unusually, unaccountably strong. I mean, it's hard to explain why it is such a strong group of faculty. And in the core of graduate students who do a tremendous amount of the teaching for the department. I think those are the two strengths.
Right. And what's the secret to, people seem to get along in the English department. I mean, there are no, people used to talk about culture wars. I don't think that spirit prevails. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree. Yeah, and I'm not quite sure how to explain that. I think that everyone works very hard, and we recognize that each other are working very hard, and it's a cooperative effort. Maybe this is one of the positive aspects of an underfunded, to go back to that unpleasant subject, university, that everyone has to pull his or her own weight, and everyone respects the effort that goes into doing that.
So if you had a kind of a wish list for the English department, within our, you're mentioning the realism of what can be afforded, and maybe even including, seeking funding, external funding, that sort of thing. What would you like to see? Where do you think the money would be best spent?
That's a great question. That's a hard question. I think that the number one factor in a really quality education in the humanities context, forgetting about the parts of the university that I don't know about, is class size. I think that it's a little bit of a crime that students are so infrequently sitting around a seminar table and discussing with a professor an issue of real concern to them. And that's just a fact of finances and numbers. We try to make that happen as often as possible. We create senior level seminars so that English majors will have that opportunity. But if we could give them that opportunity for all 4 years in every class they take, I think that would be the ideal.
Of course, you were an undergraduate at Princeton.
Yeah, so I was spoiled.
You were spoiled, and they had that. Maybe you could let our audience know what this preceptorial system was about and how we might try to emulate that.
Yeah, I don't know if it would be possible to emulate
with
it based on the realities.
The finances.
That is that's a private university, and so it's not a comparable situation by any means. But that system really was wonderful. As a freshman, I remember classes, sometimes very large classes of 250 students, with a magnificent, world-renowned professor lecturing on Shakespeare. But the class would meet, I think it was usually twice a week, with another professor in a very small room, usually the professor's office with chairs circling the office, for an hour or an hour and a half long discussion of the lecture and the reading material. So it was a combination of both forms, both lecture and discussion. And it was really challenging. And it was really challenging in large part because the students were such a dynamic part of that discussion group. And that's not because they were Princeton students, because our own students are fantastic when you can get them into a small room and challenge them with really interesting material. We don't get to do that as often as I wish we did.
So if there are some potential donors who are listening to this to this conversation, what would be, I mean, what are sort of realistically, what can a donor do to make this situation more possible than it is now? Is there anything, or is this a matter of just huge state funds that we just don't have?
Well, I guess it has to come from both sources and all available sources. But there are very generous donors who give to the department and who give specifically for the purpose that I just mentioned, the creation of smaller classes. And so we even named those classes after that donor and called them the so-and-so capstone seminars.
So give us an example, I mean, if it's okay to talk about that here. So for example, so that there are seminars that are made possible by external funding.
That's right, because in order to create that seminar, we have to either deny other students a place in the classroom, or we have to create another class for those other students. So that involves hiring extra teaching power.
So what the money does is allow you to have hire people to teach, so that the University of Oregon faculty can teach small classes.
That's exactly right. And that can't happen without the funding. I mean, we could just make this happen ourselves if we were willing to deny access to courses from enrolled University of Oregon students. We could keep all of our classes to 10, and when the 10 filled up, we would simply say no more. But obviously, we are a public university, and we have a responsibility to educate the people who pay to come here.
Well, I'm glad we were able to put that concrete example out there for people to be able to help improve the state of higher education in the state of Oregon. Harry Wonham, it's great to have had you with us.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be here.
And we've been speaking with Harry Wonham, professor and head of the Department of English. Thanks for watching.